Today's video is sponsored by Ridge, and you might know Ridge for their wallets, but they have a great new product, and that would be rings. And let me tell you, it's not just any ordinary ring, it is the Ridge beveled ring set. Look, these rings are built to really last. They're made with high quality materials like carbon fiber, tungsten carbide, and titanium, and you're sure to find the perfect ring for any occasion. And let's not forget about the silicone band that comes with each set. It's perfect for when you want to be comfortable or casual. Plus, with the lost and resizing protection program, you can exchange your ring for a different size if needed. Yep, each purchase comes with the option of 2 future exchanges for the same ring in the same or different size. Now, if you know anything about Ridge, you'll know that they're all about minimalist, functional, and reliable gear that's built for life. I've talked about their wallets and key cases on this channel, like how functional and comfortable they are, and now there are these rings. So look, if you're looking for a ring that's not only functional but also stylish, head to ridge.com and use my unique link, ridge.com/shadows, and don't forget to use the promo code shadows and you'll get a 10% discount. ridge.com/shadows, promo code shadows. There's a link below. Thanks to Ridge for sponsoring. And now today's video. In 1880, he coins the term delirium of denial to describe her denial of her own existence, which he considered a severe form of depression. Tragically, though, he had no way to treat her, and she died soon after of starvation. The term Cotard syndrome came later, in 1893, when Emile Regis argued that this was not a singular clinical entity, but a collection of symptoms. So Cotard didn't discover a new disease, but at least he got his name on one of the world's most fascinating syndromes. Cotard's develops slowly and comes in 3 distinct stages. The first is the germination stage. This usually presents as severe depression and hypochondria. For example, one woman, Ms. S, experienced insomnia, loneliness, and a loss of interest in her surroundings and work long before she presented herself at the hospital, claiming her heart was missing and her liver was putrefying. The next phase is known as the blooming stage. This is where the symptoms become easily recognizable as catarrhs. Patients will claim that they have missing or rotting body parts, that they're dead, or that they don't exist at all. Hence the nickname walking corpse syndrome. In one case, an 88-year-old man was admitted to hospital when he became severely depressed. The source of his distress was that he was devastated that he'd recently died and not one member of his family had bothered to bury him. During the blooming stage, sufferers also start to neglect their basic needs, like eating, drinking, and personal hygiene. For example, one 46-year-old sufferer believed that her brain and intestines had disappeared and she'd been left as a translucent body without content. Believing that what remained of her was fragile and soluble, she refused to bathe as she was terrified that her body would simply wash away. The last phase of catarrhs is the chronic stage. This is diagnosed when the delusions last for a long time, causing the patient to inflict physical harm on themselves, usually by refusing to eat, drink, or defecate. Most patients in this stage also experience severe psychiatric depression as they become more and more detached from reality and unable to experience any pleasure. It's often worsened by the feeling that they've died, but are trapped and are unable to move on. Mademoiselle X claimed that she was eternal and would live forever, as she couldn't die by natural causes. In desperation, she begged to be buried alive. The causes of Cotard syndrome are not fully understood, but most neurologists agree that it likely begins with damage or disorders in 2 separate parts of the brain. The fusiform gyrus, responsible for facial recognition, and the amygdala, responsible for generating the emotions we feel when we see a familiar face. On its own, this damage presents as Capgras syndrome, a disorder in which people become convinced that their family and friends have been replaced by imposters because they either don't recognize them or no longer feel anything for them. In one case, a boy became so convinced that his father had been replaced that he beheaded him, looking for the microchips that would prove that he was a robot. The link between Capgras and catarrhs is clear. When someone with Capgras looks in a mirror and they can't recognize their own face, they may begin to believe that they don't exist. However, most people will be able to talk themselves out of this with a bit of logic, a touch of their face, a pinch of their skin. So for catarrhs to occur, there needs to be one more issue: an area of damage or disorder causing psychosis and impairment of rational thinking. This means that when a Cotard patient looks in the mirror and starts wondering if they exist, their brain won't automatically reject the idea. Instead, it'll run with it, and they'll wind up with a firm delusion that they're actually dead. Now, clearly, it's incredibly rare for just the right amount of damage to occur in just the right pattern across the brain, which is why there have only been 200 known cases to date. These have been caused by dementia, encephalopathy, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, stroke, and traumatic brain injuries. One 35-year-old ex-soldier named Warren McKinley developed his catarrhs after a serious motorcycle accident. He became convinced that he'd died in the crash, but for some reason his spirit had been trapped and he hadn't been able to move on. So he stopped eating, drinking, and talking to people, as he was sure there was no point. Fortunately, he got lucky when he was sent to a rehabilitation centre where, at 1,000,000,000 odds, he met another walking corpse sufferer. His new friend explains that as he had died and everyone was sure he still had a body, he had decided to just start again with a new identity, and together they worked through living with the condition. Strangely, there is one more thing that can cause catarrhs, and it has nothing to do with brain damage. It's a medication called acyclovir, and it's used to treat cold sores, herpes, and shingles. Unfortunately, it can also make you think that you're dead, as one woman experienced before she ran screaming into a hospital desperate for help. It took 1 hour of dialysis before she had calmed down enough to explain to the doctors that she had been screaming because she thought she had died. It took 24 hours before she'd accept that all of her body parts were hers. Patients with blooming or chronic catarrhs are generally easy to spot, and most are pretty open about the fact that they're dead. I mean, there's no sense in being shy if you're already gone and the world has no point or meaning. In 1788, in the earliest written description of catarrhs, an elderly woman had been cooking when she'd suddenly become paralyzed down one side of her body. Fortunately, she recovered and regained her movement quickly, but she was left with the conviction that she'd died. Frustrated that her family was doing nothing about her body, she took matters into her own hands. This meant she'd spent the next week nagging and pestering her daughters to dress her in a shroud and place her in a coffin. Eventually, they gave in, dressed her, and laid her body out for mourning. The woman still wasn't happy, though, and spent the entirety of her wake fussing and complaining about the colour of her shroud. Eventually, she fell asleep, and her family put her to bed and treated her with a powder of precious stones and opium. This cured her temporarily, but the delusions returned every couple of months. It's unclear if the family was forced to hold her awake each time. In some cases, catarrh sufferers start trying to find ways to be with others like them, people who are actually dead. One 53-year-old Filipino woman ended up being admitted to a psychiatric unit because she'd explained to her family that she smelled like rotting flesh and needed to be taken to the morgue to be with other dead people. They called 911 instead. In another case, a British man known as Graham started hanging out in a graveyard because it was the closest that he could get to death, but the police kept taking him home. He believed that his brain had died or was, at best, missing following a suicide attempt. In hospital, he tried to refuse medication. Drugs clearly couldn't work on a brain that didn't exist. Graham was a breakthrough case, as his was the first catarrh patient to ever receive a PET scan. Shockingly, it revealed that the metabolic activity across his frontal and parietal brain regions was so low that it mimicked that of a patient in a vegetative state. His doctor claimed that with a brain scan like that, he shouldn't have even been awake, never mind walking around and interacting with people. Chase's first symptom of the syndrome was extremely poor hygiene, which presented at a very young age. Later, he developed severe hypochondria and became so convinced that his skull had broken into pieces that he shaved his head to track their movements. This hypochondria developed into his most dangerous belief that his blood and organs were slowly turning to powder and that in order to survive, they'd have to be replaced. He began his self-treatment regime with animals, killing them, blending their organs with soda, and drinking the concoction. In one case, police found him covered in blood with a cow's liver in a bucket. When they asked him whose blood it was, he said that it was his own and it had leaked out. This was apparently good enough, and they didn't arrest him. On another occasion, he became violently ill after killing a rabbit and injecting himself with its blood. This time, he was institutionalized in a mental health facility. There, he'd kill small birds, drink their blood, and eat their organs, earning him the nickname Dracula by the medical staff. So, naturally, they considered him rehabilitated and released him. Devastatingly, in December 1977, he committed his first murder. The victim, Ambrose Griffin, was a 51-year-old man who was helping his wife bring in groceries when Chase pulled up and shot him in the chest. A month later, Chase entered the home of pregnant Teresa Wallin, stabbed her, butchered her, and used a yogurt container to scoop up and drink her blood. Then, just 4 days later, he massacred a woman, her 2 small children, and her friend. The woman, Evelyn Muroth, was found partially cannibalized, and her body had been raped. Chase wasn't careful, and he left bloody prints everywhere, so the police had no trouble identifying him. At his apartment, they found that all of his utensils were covered in blood, and his fridge contained human brains. This time, he was arrested, and he was sentenced to death by gas chamber. In prison, his fellow inmates feared him and encouraged him to kill himself, so he stockpiled his anti-anxiety meds, and on Boxing Day 1980, he took a fatal overdose. Treatment for catarrhs will vary according to the underlying cause, but it generally involves a combination of therapy, antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers. Unfortunately, it normally takes months or even years before patients see any improvement. In the case of Esme Wang, a young sufferer in her 30s, she didn't even notice she was getting better until one day somebody pointed out that she was acting differently, and she suddenly realized that she thought she was alive. If medication fails, some patients are recommended electroconvulsive therapy or ECT. This involves passing a small electric current through the brain to generate small seizures, and it's sometimes been successful. In 2005, a 32-year-old man arrived at a hospital with an incredibly rare combination of catarrhs and lycanthropy, a disorder that makes sufferers believe they're wolves or other animals. In his case, he thought that he and his wife had been turned into dogs, his daughters were sheep, and they'd all been killed. Fortunately, electroconvulsive therapy worked, and he was relieved of the worst of his symptoms. However, ECT is never the first choice, as it comes with risks, including memory loss, muscle pain, nausea, and confusion. One thing that's clear, though, is that whichever way a patient is treated, it's extremely unlikely that they'll ever be the same again. Graham reports feeling less brain dead, but still bizarre sometimes, and Wang was left with weakness, fatigue, and insomnia. Another patient who was diagnosed after presenting himself to doctors and declaring, "I guess I am dead, I'd like to ask for your opinion," has also technically been cured. Strangely, though, when questioned about his current state, he says, "Now I am alive, but I was once dead at that time." Which indicates that although the delusion has passed, his experience of catarrhs is still very much his reality.